वेलकम टू आवर नेशन स्टेट डायलॉग सीरीज राष्ट्रीय संवाद श्रृंखला में आपका स्वागत है. 欢迎收看民族国家对话系列. I'm Dr. Geeta Kochar, moderator for today's discussion. Today it's our pleasure and privilege to have with us Professor Liu Yawei. Professor Liu Yawei is the director of China program at the Carter Center, Atlanta. He became a member of the Council on Foreign Relations in 2014. He is the associate director of the China Research Center in Atlanta and an adjunct professor of political science at Emory University. An expert on U.S. China relations and Chinese grassroots democracy, he is regularly invited to speak about Chinese public opinion, and his previous engagements included the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the Brookings Institution, the Ukrainian National Academy of Sciences, and the Institute for China-American Studies. He has 3 edited volumes, Rural Elections and Governance in Contemporary China, published by Northwestern University Press, Xi'an in 2002 and 2004. The Political Readers, China Central Translation Bureau Press, Beijing, 2006. And Elections and Governance, published by Northwestern University Press, Xi'an, 2009, and many other published works. With this brief introduction, let's start, the discussion today. We have invited Professor Liu to discuss on China's democracy under Xi Jinping and U.S.-China relations. Welcome to our show.
Thank you.
So, let me begin by, starting from asking you how, just explain briefly about how Xi Jinping's third term changes the established constitution of the PRC and what it says about the inner party democracy of China.
Thanks for that question. I think there's some misunderstanding about the third term and the Chinese constitution. So the Chinese constitution only had a term limit on the president of the country. Since the party charter, so that China is a party state. So you have the state side, you have a constitution. On the party side, you have the charter. If Xi Jinping wanted only to serve as Secretary General of the party, he didn't need to do anything. But in China, for almost more than 2 decades, the paramount leader actually has 3 titles. So one is Secretary General of the Chinese Communist Party. The other is the President of the People's Republic of China. And the third one is the Chairman of the Central Military Commission. So since he wanted to continue to have all 3 titles, then you have to change the constitution. So the logic is, serving the third term, of course, resulted in changing the state constitution, but the constitution in China is more decorative than anything else. And so I think the bigger significance of securing the third term is it makes institutionalization of power transfer a lot more difficult. If you look at the entire history of the Chinese Communist Party, when it was founded in 1921, so over 100 years. Each and every time the paramount leader of the party changed hand, either it was a dismissal, a resignation, an expulsion, or basically get the person into jail, like what happened during the Cultural Revolution. So 2012 was the only time when the transfer of power was peaceful, was orderly, and it was complete. So people were expecting that in 2022, this was going to be replicated. And the fact that it didn't happen then creates a future problem, is who the next successor is going to be, and that creates political uncertainty. And for economic growth, political uncertainty and the risks are never going to be a good thing. So that's a challenge that China has to face in the coming years.
But one of the things that we saw during the earlier president's time, that is President Hu Jintao's tenure, there were certain experiments on elections at the grassroots level, and it was expanding to the township level. So why and how has that changed under President Xi Jinping, and what are its implications for the Chinese society?
Yeah, to talk about that, we do need to go back to history, to the 80s. in the early 80s, the People's Commune collapsed in the countryside. So there was a void of political power in the countryside, because as a mechanism, People's Commune used to be the unit that governed the life and the work, of millions, hundreds of millions of Chinese farmers. So the idea came up saying China had a long history of autonomous governance, by the villagers themselves. So they started experimenting with the village committee elections. And then in mid-1990s, that's when we were first involved in promoting and observing village elections in China. So the National People's Congress of China passed organic law of China's village committees. So that law basically stipulated that every village in China, and there are about 600,000 of them in China, every 3 years, you need to have an election. Of course, initially, the election was run not according to any particular standards, because under Chinese Communist Party, China has done very few elections according to electoral standards. And that's when we were asked to provide some technical advice. So China's scholars in the late 1980s, particularly around mid-1990s, they felt that this is a silent revolution, that this is a political exercise, because 900 million Chinese farmers, they live in the countryside. There are about 600 million of them that were eligible voters. So every 3 years, they're going to nominate a candidate for the chair and for members of the committee. Every 3 years, they're going to go to the poll to vote who they had more trust as their leaders. So the scholars started saying, this is the third time that the countryside is going to sweep the urban centers. The first time was the land revolution, 土地革命, during the Civil War. The second time is in late 1970s, is the household responsibility system. So this is the third time that eventually this is going to ripple out to the urban centers. And that's, what you mentioned in the question is during the administration of Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, there were experiments at the township level. I have to emphasize the elections at the township level are the initiatives of local government officials, because they felt if villagers themselves could elect the village committee chairs, they should be able to elect their township magistrates. But after, in 1999, in Sichuan, in a township called Buyun, after that experiment, with all the voters to elect a township magistrate, which stirred up actually a lot of international coverage, it was quickly declared as unconstitutional. But the experiments continued, because many people think, they have to figure out a way, how do you move up elections from the village level, which is not part of the government system, to the higher level, county, township, things like that. And of course, 2012, there's a change of leadership. From that point on, I think the leadership focused their attention roughly on two issues. Number one, how did the Soviet Union collapse? How could we prevent that tragedy from taking place in China? And then the focus is going to be on, we have to strengthen the party. The second issue is there's growing consensus among the Chinese leaders that the Chinese system actually works. The previous leaders felt the China's political system, from Deng Xiaoping on all the way to Wen Jiabao, they all basically believe the success of all reforms in China hinges on the success of the ultimate political reform. So they were focusing on that. How do you introduce political reform in China? Is it separate of the party and the state? Is it, choice? Is it accountability and things like that? But after 2012, the focus is more our system delivered, as we discussed earlier, that, our system moved Chinese people out of poverty. Our system has enabled China to be the second largest economy. Our system has enabled China to become more influential in the global affairs. So the focus has been on China story, China wisdom, China plans, and China solutions. So the earlier experiments were all shelved.
So before I move into more about the political reforms that you're talking, let me just get another clarification for our audience where you mentioned household responsibility system. Can you just elaborate that a little bit?
So you know, in the 50s, China started forming the People's Communist System. And so every farmer, they work for the collective. They are not working for themselves. So they don't own any land. So until today, China still has no private ownership of any land. I see you freeze. Were you able to hear me? Do I sound all right?
Yes, I'm able to hear you.
Okay.
Right.
So in the late 70s, local officials realized in order to get the farmers to really be productive, you need to move them out of the collective and allow them to work for themselves. So that's when the household responsibility system came in. So the land, according to the number of people in each household, is leased to the farmers. So the farmers now are working on their own land, and then they sell the crop from the land, and then they will have surplus. So the more surplus they have, then they can sell them in the marketplace. So that's the household responsibility system. So the lease of the land to the family is 30 years. So they renewed it once, and then I think shortly the third renewal is going to come. So again, there is no private ownership of land in China. There is no sales of rural land, and that of course has a huge impact on the scale of the agricultural production.
Okay, you just mentioned about China has a system which is very unique. It has a best system. It has got it is what has created the China model, has created the success of Chinese economy and rooted out rural poverty and things like that. And you have done a lot of work on US as well. So let me just pull you towards this side of, about the talk that there is a different system and ideology of China and US, which also is one of the reasons why there is a rivalry between China and US. So what is your opinion on that? How do you see these two different systems and different ideologies?
I think there's, personally, I think there are problems how to frame current U.S.-China rivalry. Americans, particularly the Biden administration, like to frame this up as autocracy versus democracy. I think the rivalry has a lot more than this ideological difference. From the China side, actually, they think U.S. is, this is the wrong approach. Xi Jinping recently introduced the Global Civilization Initiative. I think the whole idea is basically to inform the whole world. There is such a thing called Western civilization. There's also such a thing called Chinese civilization. Maybe there is such a thing called Indian civilization. So all civilizations need to have equal status on the global stage. So China want to downgrade this sort of political rivalry into something more economic. Is basically the key of U.S.-China rivalry has little to do with ideology. It has more to do with economic growth. It has more to do with trade. It has more to do with high technology. It has more to do with national security. I do believe that we should take that into consideration. If you look at how U.S. now is approaching China, a lot of the measures they put in place is actually economic, and it looks like the technology decoupling, the tariff and all these things, and they're more economic than anything else. It doesn't mean that there is no ideological dispute. I think Henry Kissinger wrote in his book on China, saying Americans won't be Americans if we don't care where the legitimatization of the power comes from, if we don't care about how government treats their own people. I think that says a lot about who Americans are, what's their identity, and why they care. about China's politics, but we do need to maintain a very balanced view of what is the political source of the rivalry, but more importantly, what is the source of economic rivalry. And there is a lot of concern on the American side that China is going to not only catch up, but China will soon overtake U.S. in terms of its economic prowess and output.
Yeah, so suppose, I mean, that becomes a reality in the sense that China really takes over US. How do you see the structure of the world and the rule of law getting impacted? I mean, considering that you just mentioned that most of the Western world is looking at China as an autocratic state, more of a dictatorial kind of thing. Do you see the rivalry between the US and China will get intensified, and how that will be impacted? How these structures are going to be changed?
I want to start answering this question by saying China is not going to take over the world anytime soon. China is not going to overtake the US economically or otherwise. China has so many internal problems and uncertainties, one of which we talked about when I answered the first question is the power transfer issue. So there is a lot of paranoia on the part of the US and other European countries that as if, tomorrow when you wake up, China is going to be the number one. And then the concern has been blown up that with its economic power, China is going to export its political model. China is going to overthrow the rule-based international order, that China is going to basically undermine, global democracy. I don't think that is going to happen. China has never said that they're going to overthrow the current global system. China is not very happy with some of the rules of the global system. They want to reform it. For example, they were very upset when International Monetary Fund refused to make Chinese currency, part of the basket of revenues that the International Monetary Fund has, and other, international agencies, international regulators. If you look at AIIB, which has made a lot of loans to India, they pretty much follow the standards of World Bank and other international financial agencies. Whether China certainly wanted other countries to emulate China, like African country, Ethiopia, South Africa, maybe other countries. But I don't think the China model can be emulated anywhere else. So I'm not very concerned about the China system going to, move across the Chinese border and it will be adopted by other countries. At the same time, I think the global community is paying a lot of attention to how China conducts itself internationally, and China cannot do things free of concerns about how they're going to be perceived by other countries, and there will be a lot of effort to contain China on that front. So I think in the coming decades, number one, China is not going to shine as many have expected it to be. Number two, in terms of how China model and the Western standards are going to coexist, I think it will evolve, and eventually, I think China will continue to be part of the international system. To pushing China out of the system, if that's what Americans and others wanted, that's not only going to be disastrous for China, it's also going to be disastrous for the whole world.
But let me just go back to what you pointed out in terms of the political reforms in China. How do you see, about, the future of political reforms in China? Where does you think that US miscalculated the whole notion that China is going to be having political reforms and China's reforms will progress according to the political reforms that will happen, even though, there was a deeper engagement between the two powers? And this is also my last.
Yeah, I think political reform, as we understand it, right now has come to a standstill. If you read the political report of the 18th Party Congress, 19th Party Congress, the 20th Party Congress, they continue to talk about political reform. They talk about reforming the National People's Congress system. They talk about administrative reform. They talk about how to get young generation of leaders in place, but there is no meaningful, real thinking of what is the Chinese system of choice. How leaders at different levels of governance emerge. Whether people can be involved in making decisions. All of this, I don't think it's on anyone's agenda. So therefore, we don't know when political reform will be re-jump started down the road. I don't think China can become a superpower unless political reform is introduced, incorporated into China's governing system, and meaningfully institutionalized, and not to be disrupted by any individual.
Okay. Sounds very interesting. China cannot become the superpower unless and until it goes thank you for this very great and interesting, talk. And I can just go on and on with it, but I know that there are time limitations for you as well as for our channel. Hope we continue our interactions. Thank you, Professor Liu Yawei, for coming to our channel. To our viewers, please hit the like icon and subscribe to our channel for many more interesting discussions on China and related subjects. Thank you very much.